When I started posting these videos, I was assuming that most of the people watching them would already have read some of my works and be familiar with them. Turns out that isn't necessarily the case. So I thought I'd better do a couple of videos explaining the basic idea behind my 4 cultures: magic, art, religion and science. This was first expressed in the book which is my most well-known and best-selling book, SSOTBME, an essay on magic, which first came out in 1974. And this is a later edition, but they all contain this diagram which shows the 4 cultures and the relationship between them: art, religion, magic and science. As I explained in the next video, I got the idea of cultures from C.P. Snow in the 50s. Now, why do I choose the word cultures rather than simply talking about magic, art, religion and science? The reason is that if you make any statements about any of those 4 things and the person disagrees, you tend to just get into a sort of retreating argument where they go back to perfection. It goes like this, if I say Christianity can be divisive, a Christian might say, oh, that's nonsense. It's all about, the brotherhood of man and so on and so forth. And if you say, well, what about Northern Ireland? Oh, well, that isn't really Christianity, that's politics, really. Well, what about the Spanish Inquisition? You have to bear in mind, the very different culture of the times. What about some of the statements in the Old Testament? That's the Old Testament, remember, in the New Testament, and so on. So you can't actually say anything very much about it because there's always retreating to a sort of a perfect ideal. And the same is true with all of them. In another video, I said how faith is really fundamental and strong in the science community, in the science culture. Now, of course, if I'd said that it's strong in science, that would have been quite untrue because science is based very much on open-mindedness. And yet, the science culture actually has a very, very strong faith in the existence of the material world. And so on. So that is why I sort of tend to talk more about these as 4 cultures than as 4 sort of abstract ideas. Now, when I show that diagram, people sometimes see it as a sort of division into 4 boxes, as it were, 4 separate things. And that is very much not what I'm trying to do. I think the reason we tend to see that and think, oh, he's putting these into 4 box categories, is because our background is more scientific and religious culture. And science and religion both tend to go in for clear-cut boundaries. In religion, if someone says, are you a Catholic or Protestant, they don't expect you to say both. In something like supporting football, which to me is a religious type of culture, you don't go to a match supporting both sides. You make up your mind you're going to support one or the other. And in academia, they're very suspicious of cross-cultural, cross-discipline studies. So there is this idea of boundaries as being very meaningful and very important, the believers, the non-believers, and so on. And the same is true in science in a different sort of way, because I think a scientist wouldn't be very happy with my talking about cultures, because I'm talking about rather ill-defined concepts. They say, what exactly do you mean? What exactly is magic? What exactly is science? And I'm not talking like that. I'm really talking about things that I can recognize. And in art too, there's a different attitude to boundaries. There are plenty of boundaries and distinctions in art world, impressionist, expressionist, and so on and so forth, jazz, classical. But they're almost sort of hurdles, challenges for artists to jump across. As soon as you make a distinction, like in the 50s, there was very clear difference, jazz and serious classical music. And then the Modern Jazz Quartet produced a record called Third Stream Music, which tried its best to jump across those boundaries and mix the two. And we've all heard these sort of interviews with artists where someone says something like, now you've been claimed to be the leading British postnatal depressionist, what is your opinion of that? And the artist says, I can't stand these labels. I prefer to see my work in terms of blah, 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 blah. So a different attitude again to boundaries in the arts culture. Now in magic culture, there's something which I think is quite extraordinary, particularly to the religious and scientific cultures, in that when you have magical categories, on the whole, every category contains all the others. It is actually a fractal analysis. And I'd better give some examples. The tree of life of the Kabbalists, the 10 spheres. Now, it is said that every one of those spheres contains the whole tree of life. It has the 10 spheres within it. And then, of course, each of those spheres has the 10 spheres. It's a fractal revision that goes on forever. Think of earth, air, fire, water. 4 quite clear different things. And yet, each contains all the others. Because, as Crowley shows in the Book of Thoth, you can break down earth of earth, fire of earth, water of earth, air of earth. And he does that. And, of course, same thing happens in the tarot pack, where each of the 4 suits then has 4 court cards subdividing that suit into the elements. And even in astrology, with harmonic astrology or cyclic astrology, you can break down Aries into cycles of the 12 elements within that Aries, and so on. So in general, when you have a category in magical thinking, it is actually a complete thing in its sense that it contains all the others and it breaks down further and further. And the same is true of my 4 cultures, because actually each of those cultures, although it is clearly, in my mind, something different, it actually contains all the others. My favourite example is to ask the question, is building a church an act of magic or an act of religion? Now, insofar as building a church means you take bricks, mortar, a place, and you make something sacred, that is an act of magic. Because I see magic as very much about bringing spirit down into matter, into everyday life. As I put it in another video, it is about planting seeds of meaning in our normal everyday life and then letting those seeds grow. And so, building a church is clearly an act of magic. And yet, why is it done? It is to create a space so that people from their everyday lives can come into that place and, as it were, be lifted up to heaven or to God, into the Spirit. And that is a religious direction of movement. And so it is both magical and it is also a religious act. And that isn't a problem for religious people, because unless they feel that it is turning into idolatry. If people start coming to church purely for the sacred buzz they get, rather than in order to be lifted up to spirit, then it's considered to be idolatry, and religious culture doesn't like it. And of course, there's also science in building a church, and there is obviously art in building a church. All the cultures are there. And I could say the same thing of all cultures. For instance, a scientist, ask a scientist why they're doing a certain line of research or experiment. And to me, the sort of strict science of science answer would be something like, I wish to eliminate certain erroneous hypotheses, and I'm doing this experiment to prove that. But the scientist might say something like, I want to further human knowledge and find out the truth. And that to me is more a religious explanation of why you're doing it. The scientist might say, this is a very muddled subject, but I think that behind it there's a simple, beautiful theory or truth which explains it all, and I want to find that. And that scientist has been more like a sculptor, sort of, chipping away the unnecessary to reveal the beauty within type thing. It's more of an artistic approach, and so on. So, in presenting this thing, I'm not saying I'm splitting the world into 4 boxes. I'm presenting a fractal magical analysis. Now, this can be very perplexing if you're used to clear boundaries. How could you work with something like that? Well, actually, we are well used to working with these fractal boundaries. And I'll give you an example. I should have prepared this beforehand. Hang on. Here we are. This, oh dear, I've got to calibrate it. Anyway, the compass is not a division of the world into 4 separate boxes. I know it is sometimes used like that. People talk about the north, the south, the east versus the west, and so on. But actually, go to anywhere in the world, except perhaps the North Pole and the South Pole, forget that, and there'll be just as much northness, southness, eastness, westness wherever you go. Cape Town is definitely a southern town compared with Oslo, and yet there's just as much north in Cape Town as there is in Oslo. You see, we're actually used to working with these fractal divisions because they are not so much boxes in a defining sense as directions. And it's quite interesting to me because that sense of direction, that spatial sense, people associated with what they call right brain thinking. Now, whether it's in the right half of the brain or not, I'm not interested in, but there is definitely a sort of different spatial way of thinking, which is distinct from the sort of linear defining, which is the left brain thinking. And so you could say that the distinction between magic and art and religion and science is that the former depends more on right brain spatial sense than on the defining left brain sense. I mentioned that as an aside. So the point is that I created this model, and the compass is a good example because I was not, and I emphasize it, I was not trying to sort of lay down a definition of magic or define a new school of magic or anything like that. I was actually just trying to, as an explorer, to find my way around. Now you see, I'm not trying to sort of simplify magic down because magic is a wonderfully chaotic area. It's been out of academia, it's been unstudied officially for years, for centuries. And so it's a mass of different ideas and competing theories and philosophies and methods. And I think that's terrific. I love it. I don't want to tidy that up, but I want a compass to find my way around this jungle. And that really is what I've created. And that is how I'd like people to see this, as if they find it useful to help yourself, find direction, and to avoid some of these sort of very silly arguments that go on, but if it can do that, and helps you find your way around, then I think it's useful. And in a second video, I'll explain another aspect of it. I've talked about how one culture sort of progresses to the next one. There's a cyclic element, and I'll explain that in a second video.